The house had finally gone quiet that night. I sat alone at the kitchen table with a warm cup of tea that had already started to cool. I only wanted to check our finances for a moment before going to bed. I opened the bank app on my phone and looked at the latest transactions. The numbers felt ordinary, the kind I see almost every day. Nothing about them seemed urgent or unusual. For a second, I almost closed the app and moved on. There wasn't a single transaction that looked like a problem. Still, something made me stay and look a little longer. I began scrolling through the list more slowly than before. The numbers themselves were small, almost forgettable. Yet the longer I looked, the more something felt slightly off. Sitting there that night, a quiet thought slowly formed in my mind. Family finances don't always change because of one big decision. Sometimes they shift because of small choices that feel too ordinary to notice. My name's Clara, and lately I've been trying to understand our family life a little more carefully. Most days feel ordinary and predictable. We've always believed we were careful enough with money. Still, at the end of many months, I notice a quiet confusion. The money seems to disappear faster than I expect. Yet I cannot remember making any big decision about spending. So I began retracing the past few weeks in my mind. I try to remember what we actually spent money on. Nothing expensive comes to mind. Most of the things feel completely normal for a Mother's Day. A cup of coffee when the afternoon feels long, or a small delivery that makes chores a little easier. I rarely think much about these things. Each amount feels too small to matter. They simply blend into the rhythm of daily life. But that night, I decide to slow down and look more carefully. I open the transaction list on my phone. This time, I read each line with patience. The longer I look, the more unusual it begins to feel. Each transaction alone looks harmless, but together they start telling a different story. That is when I began to notice something I had never seen before. Our financial story wasn't built from big decisions. It was shaped by small choices repeating almost every day. Lately, I've been thinking about the small habits that quietly shape our days. Many decisions happen quickly, almost without a pause. At the time, everything simply feels normal. Being a mother often means holding many thoughts at once. The day moves quickly from one small task to another. Sometimes a quick decision feels like the easiest way to keep things moving. Buying something convenient can feel like a small relief. Saving a little time often feels valuable during a busy day. In those moments, the choice always seems reasonable. I never felt like I was making major financial decisions. Most of them were just small, everyday choices. But those small choices quietly repeat themselves. I'm beginning to understand how habits quietly form. Small actions slowly turn into patterns. And once they become patterns, we rarely question them. For a long time, I focused on the bigger plans, savings, future goals, and things that felt important. The small everyday habits rarely entered the conversation. Yet, family life is mostly built from ordinary routines. Small decisions appear far more often than big ones. Over time, their impact quietly grows. That night, I began to see money differently. Not as a story of big decisions, but as a quiet story shaped by small daily choices. I kept scrolling through the list of transactions longer than I expected. Small numbers appeared again and again in quiet repetition. None of them felt important on their own, but together they began to form a quiet pattern. I started remembering the small moments behind those numbers. A quick coffee on a busy morning, a small online order that felt like a quiet reward after a long day. At the time, each decision felt completely normal. Nothing about those moments felt careless. They were simply small parts of an ordinary day. But seeing everything gathered in one place felt different. The small purchases lined up quietly beside each other. Together, they told a story I had never really noticed before. I began to notice something that made me pause. Many of those choices had happened almost automatically. I rarely stopped to think before making them. Sometimes I bought something because the day felt exhausting. Sometimes it simply felt faster and easier. And sometimes it just didn't seem like a big deal. That was the moment I started feeling slightly uncomfortable. Not because the amount was shocking, but because I had barely noticed it happening. That night, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for a long time. One simple question stayed in my mind. What if the biggest changes begin with the smallest choices? Slowly, a clearer picture began to form in my mind. The small choices scattered across my days were not random after all. They were quietly pointing in a direction I had never fully noticed before. Most of those choices had felt too small to matter. A coffee here, a quick order there, a little reward after a tiring day. But small things have a quiet way of repeating themselves. I began to notice how money quietly follows patterns. Not only the plans we write down, but the habits we repeat without thinking. And habits often begin with decisions that barely feel like decisions. That night, I looked at money a little differently. It was no longer just about big decisions or careful plans. It felt more like a trail made from many quiet steps. The idea itself felt surprisingly simple. Maybe I had been watching the wrong things all along. Big changes rarely begin in big moments. Strangely, I did not feel guilty looking at those transactions. It felt more like discovering a quiet lesson I had somehow missed before. Something simple, yet meaningful. That realization felt oddly comforting. If small habits could slowly create problems, perhaps they could also create something better. Change might not need to be dramatic after all. A quiet thought appeared before I went to sleep. What if I simply paid more attention to the small choices each day? Not with pressure, but with awareness. The next morning, I decided to try something simple. I didn't make strict rules or complicated plans. I only wanted to notice my small choices a little more carefully. Later that day, when I reached for something small to buy, I paused for a moment. Not because I wanted to deny myself. I just wanted to see the choice more clearly. A small question started appearing in my mind. Do I really need this right now? Or is it simply a habit I never noticed before? Some decisions stayed exactly the same as before, but a few began to feel slightly different. Just because I allowed myself a moment to think, I didn't expect myself to change everything in one day. Small adjustments felt more honest for my life, especially in a home that is always a little busy. After a few days, I noticed something unexpected. It wasn't only the money that felt more organized. My mind also felt a little lighter. That small awareness stayed with me during the day. I was no longer moving entirely on autopilot. There was a little space to pause and notice. And that small space turned out to matter more than I expected, because change often begins quietly. Not in dramatic moments, but in consistent ones. A quiet understanding slowly began to form in my mind. Family life, it turns out, is shaped by many small habits we barely notice. The big decisions matter, but the little ones quietly guide our direction every day. Many small habits feel insignificant when they happen. A cup of coffee, a quick purchase, a simple decision during a busy morning. Yet, repeated quietly over time, they begin to leave their marks. I also realize that change does not always need to be dramatic. Sometimes a quiet adjustment repeated each day is enough. Small steps often stay with us longer because they feel possible. As a mother, I often feel the quiet pressure to do everything perfectly. The meals, the schedule, the finances, the little details of the day. But real life rarely follows perfect plans. A small awareness feels more realistic than strict rules. It allows space to pause and notice what we are doing. And learning becomes easier when there is no pressure. Slowly, I began to see money differently. Not as a source of worry, but as part of everyday habits. And habits are things we can always improve. The realization itself felt surprisingly simple, yet it quietly changed how I look at daily decisions. Even the smallest choices now feel more meaningful. And strangely enough, it all began on one quiet evening at the kitchen table. A simple moment when the house was finally still. The moment I chose to truly notice the small things. Since that evening, small decisions feel different to me. Things that once seemed ordinary now carry quiet meaning. It feels like each moment is part of a longer story unfolding at home. I began to notice that every small choice has a direction. Some quietly move us closer to what we want. Others slowly drift away without us realizing it. What surprised me most was how light the change felt. Nothing dramatic happened in a single day. It simply started with a quiet moment of awareness. I didn't try to control every expense. That would only make life feel tense. I only tried to be present when a choice appeared. Family life often moves faster than we realize. Decisions happen between chores and conversations. Many moments pass before we even notice them. When things slow down even a little, new details begin to appear. Habits that once hid in the background become clearer. And change starts to feel possible. I started believing that families rarely need dramatic changes. Most improvements begin with something small. Consistency quietly does the rest. That night left me with the simplest lesson. Small choices made each day quietly shape a family's future. Little by little, they build the life we live together. For a long time, I believed that meaningful change had to begin with a big decision. Something bold, something clear, something that felt important. But life quietly showed me that change often begins in a much smaller place. A small choice rarely feels important in the moment it happens. It is just a quick decision made in the middle of an ordinary day. Yet when those moments repeat quietly, they begin shaping something bigger. As parents, we often search for the perfect decision. We imagine it must be something big enough to truly matter. But sometimes the best decision is simply the one we keep choosing again and again. Maybe this reflection feels familiar to you. Family life is full of small choices that barely get our attention. And yet those quiet decisions slowly shape the direction of our lives. These days, I see those small moments differently. They are not just ordinary parts of the day anymore. They are quiet reminders that a family's story is built one small choice at a time.